Hello, and welcome to Associated University, a group that is designed to provide supply chain management professionals with access to information and practical solutions concerning the industry's current hot topics. Today, we will be discussing how to improve warehouse and distribution labor productivity, including why successful companies have implemented labor management systems, the benefits of implementing a labor management program, and how to eliminate dark areas in your data collection to give you a true 360-degree view of your labor force and productivity. For today's webinar, we are honored to have Derek Miller, who currently serves as the Manager of Enterprise Solutions at the Raymond Corporation. Prior to joining Raymond, Derek served as the Director of Customer Success for Easy Metrics. Derek earned a Master's of Business Administration degree at Seattle University. He also served in the U.S. Coast Guard in Crisis and Incident Management. Throughout Derek's career, he has provided clients with creative solutions to complex problems, leaning forward to anticipate and understand the downstream implications of all workflow decisions. He has established a reputation for driving results that are focused on the larger business ecosystem and not just the product alone. And with that, I'll pass it over to Derek to get us started.
So today I want to talk about a couple things. We really want to talk about labor management, where it's been, where it's going, how technology impacts tracking labor and complements labor, and to really understand the story that you can get out of combining information from both labor analytics and system analytics. We're going to talk about the integration of those. We're going to talk about the concept of Internet of Things. We're going to review the WMS, traditionally how it's been used and how it might be used in the future, the benefits of looking at multiple data sources in tandem, both in terms of cost of doing business and labor impacts, and then what we will think you need to do to prepare for the future. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the future of data integration and how it tells a story. So if we're looking at labor, historical methodology has been where we use WMS information in system transactions or an ERP and manual spreadsheets for labor tracking. So typically we're getting transactional data, and manual spreadsheets have been used to augment that information. But as we look forward, hardware, whether it be fork trucks, conveyors, semi-trucks, etc., are having more and more embedded software. All of that software is creating some sort of data for one purpose or another, but we're going to look at how we might be able to leverage that data to tell a more complete story about your labor. One key thing that everyone's probably already realized is that technology is rolling out faster and it's becoming less expensive depending on when that technology was released and where it lies in terms of the technology marketplace. In the future, data will be king, so we need to talk about how we plan for it. We have to understand where your baseline is today and what steps you should be thinking about, both in terms of specific technologies, but also the general mindset in terms of how you plan for the future. Labor, software, and hardware, in addition to automation, will not only coexist, but what we're going to discuss is how they're so interdependent that combining the data from all of these systems tells you an idea about where you're spending your money, how your labor is performing, and what decisions you should be making for the future. So the first thing I would like to talk about is the concept of Internet of Things. I've got the definition up on the slide here, but what I really want to highlight is that we're living in a world of Internet of Things. Essentially, if we try to simplify it as much as possible, an Internet of Things is the concept of all systems around you creating data and tying it all together. So if I think about an average person's home, you've probably been approached when it comes to voice-activated speakers, whether it be an Amazon device, a Google device, perhaps you have app-controlled lighting in your bedroom or living room. You might have a thermostat that you can control from anywhere in the globe. So all of these systems that had traditionally been, let's call them analog, are now being connected via internet into applications, and you're going to be able to see how all of this data combines together. Maybe 2 years ago, each one of these systems was controlled by themselves through a specific interface that was designed for that system. Now, if you look at what's being marketed in the marketplace, we're actually looking at integrated systems. So you've got one interface that controls everything from your temperature to your refrigerator to your lights. So that's what we're going to be talking about in terms of Internet of Things, is the idea that not only do all of these systems create data, receive data, but the future is really understanding how they all interconnect together instead of being standalone solutions. So what we're looking at now is a diagram of the Internet of Things when it comes to a distribution center. Now, mind you, all of these things are just examples. It's not a totally inclusive list, but what we're looking at a high level is data coming from all sorts of systems. So if we just kind of go around the circle, you might have time clock. First thing at first is we're going to be talking about labor. Time clock is critical because that's going to be our benchmark in understanding what labor is out there, how many hours are you paying for, and how much are you spending on that labor. From there, what we're going to do is look at other devices and other systems to ensure that we understand what you're getting out of that labor and what you're getting out of the automation or technology that they're using. So depending on where you are in terms of how your facility is set up, we might be looking at indirect spreadsheets. That's a traditional method that a lot of people use. Telematics, if people are logging into devices, operation or identification, understanding who it is that is operating that technology or that automated piece of equipment. Checklists are people doing the processes they need to do properly before they start their work, and then what comes out of that. So you might get fleet service data, notifications as a supervisor, you're pulling in WMS. So really the idea of Internet of Things when it comes to warehousing and distribution is not only tying together data that comes out of systems that are being used, but making sure you can tie all of that together in order to make sure the right people get the right information, whether it be a supervisor, general manager, engineer, safety. If the data is valuable to you, we want to make sure you can get the data. So what we'd like to do, and we've opened up the poll for everyone on the line, is to ask a quick question related to how you're tracking labor productivity today. So you'll see some options here. The key options are that you're doing limited to no tracking. If the other option is manual tracking, so that would be where you're using spreadsheets or you're doing manual manipulation of data in order to conclude information about your productivity. The third option is you've got an LMS of some sort, and the key pieces of information you're pulling in are WMS and time clock. And the fourth option is you have an LMS of some sort, but you're also pulling in data feeds beyond WMS and time clock, so other data feeds other than that. So in just looking at the poll results, what we're seeing is that roughly 2/3 of the respondents answered that we are doing manual effort in terms of tracking, and another third is doing an existing LMS based on WMS and time clock alone. And what I'd like to say to that is that's not uncommon to hear. I would say that's reflective of the industry today. And regardless of how you answered that question, no one is behind. So I think it's everyone in the industry is evaluating what we should be doing in terms of labor tracking, and they're trying to find the best fit solution for everyone in terms of your specific operation. Everyone's operation is a little bit different. Everyone's systems that they're using are different, and really finding the sweet spot based on your industry and your client base and your labor needs is just a process that everyone is going through. So through the next slides, we're going to talk about some of the approaches to pulling in data and how moving forward towards creating a labor management system with multiple data sources may be the way of the future. So first off, I'd like to talk about what I'll call status quo for people who have limited or have WMS systems that are feeding their labor management system. I would say for most folks out there that are using an LMS and they're pulling in systematic data, for the most part, they're using WMS alone, WMS transactions alone. And what I've found in terms of interacting with clients and customers across hundreds of facilities is that we've got a problem when it comes to understanding 100% of what's going on in the facility. So if you're only looking at WMS, what you're typically doing is you're looking at a fraction of employees that are scanning. Even if those scanners are not always scanning, you're only capturing what they're doing when they're pulling the trigger on that RF device or something else. Labor is happening all over the facility, whether it be in the four walls of your facility or just outside of it. And right now, most folks, if they're only pulling in WMS, are not capturing that activity today. So what this diagram is looking at is what I would say is representative of what I'm seeing in the industry. So the white box is paid labor hours. That would be per the time clock, your total spend based on what we see, who's working, what they're paid, and the number of hours they're working. In the second box, the pink box, we see productive labor hours. Today, I would say in most facilities, we see about anywhere between 65 and 75% of total paid hours are productive. So what that's telling us is that there's 25% of paid hours that are non-productive, non-value added, can't track what the employee is doing. Essentially, it's what I would call a dark area or lost time. And the inside box, we say activity scanned in WMS. And the 40% margin there typically is what we're seeing, which is of 100% of paid hours, only 40% of those hours can be seen by looking at WMS alone. So what the end state is that we've got about 60% of paid hours that are what I call dark or yeah, but scenarios. So we're looking and saying, what did you do during those hours? And the answer is, yeah, I was doing something, but I didn't have the ability to capture my data. So we're spending a lot of time looking at that 40% when really we need to make sure that we're looking at the remaining 60% in order to understand the operation as a whole. So adding data, what's the point? The more data you add, the more you understand your operation. The real goal in moving forward is to have 100% of visibility in terms of what your employees are doing as part of the overarching system that you're running. Optimizing labor is critical prior to adding systems, because if you can't track your labor, you can't understand where your status quo is in terms of performance. And if you don't know what your status quo is in terms of performance, how do you know when you've gained productivity or gained value out of adding systems? When you optimize your labor, you get a few things. So increasing margin and cost control and increasing productivity and utilization is all part of managing your labor pool. You can also ensure that if you've got a labor management system, you have the opportunity to incentivize and recognize your employees through various programs. And you can really optimize your labor planning based on true productivity. So if you can track it and you understand how people are performing, you have standards in place, you've optimized your systems, and you've put incentive programs in place, now you have a true idea of what your productivity is based on labor alone. At that point, you can evaluate whether or not you're going to use people to perform a task, whether you're going to evaluate new hardware, or potentially evaluate automation. With automation, the question is often, how do I make sure I'm making the right choice? And how am I sure that I'm not following a fad? Will the investment today give me a leg up on the future, or can I wait? The end goal for everybody is, creating better service for your end customer, whether it be faster fulfillment, automation, and data management that you can provide versus asking them to provide it for you. And ultimately, by maximizing productivity and adding technology is really driving better pricing so that you can remain competitive. The key point there is, though, that before you do any of that, you have to make sure that you understand where you are today. So really, a labor management system is critical, and making sure you understand what today is doing, so that way you can figure out whether or not tomorrow you need to invest in technology, more people, or both. So what I'm going to go into now is some integration examples. So these are just a couple examples of where we've seen being able to integrate technology and labor analytics to tell a more complete story, to get more value out of your system, and to understand opportunity moving forward. So the four we're going to talk about specifically is the integration of conveyor systems. I've got some examples about over the road. We've got wearable technology and job coding. Towards the end, we'll cover a couple additional areas that could be considerations for integration. And then at the end, if there's any questions about other systems, we can make sure we answer those as part of the questions. So conveyors, what's the value? I think people understand conveyors can help you in terms of the number of touches, in terms of product, moving product around systematically without people touching product. But one of the key parts of conveyors is they can be reasonably priced, they can be incredibly expensive. So really understanding what level of investment that you want to make is based on your operation and what you're getting out of status quo. So from a labor management perspective, you really want to understand what it costs you to do the work today. So if you're using people to move product, what does that cost you? What does it cost you per case? What does it cost you per pallet to move that product around? Because keeping in mind, you're shifting cost towards technology if you add conveyors to your operation. So it's not a question of eliminating that spend, it's shifting that spend. So before you do anything, you need to understand the true cost to perform. Once you've installed, we really want to talk about the new cost and the ROI. So one of the big things that we'll find is that with conveyor systems, you're not replacing labor, you're just replacing certain touch points. Usually at the beginning or end of the system, there's still individuals, labor, people touching the product to get the flow started and to end it. So if I was thinking about conveyor data, what would be my go, no-go questions I'd ask? So again, what does it cost me to perform the task today? The second question would be, is my labor optimized? If it's not, it should be. Status quo pricing is critical. So let's say today it costs you $1.50 to do a task. Well, potentially you could get that down to $1 instead of $1.50 by optimizing your labor. So status quo in terms of labor is good information to know, but we have to really understand what we can get and what efficiencies we can gain with labor alone before we start adding technology. The third question I'd ask is, what's the price of the conveyor and how much labor will it fully reduce? One of the things that we'll touch on in terms of technology is that there is often this assumption that adding technology will fully eliminate the need for labor. That in and of itself is typically not the case. And so at least is a first step into technology. So one of the things we need to understand is the process flow. Even if I optimize my labor, what labor will still exist after I've entered into the conveyor world? Another thing to consider is with all technology is the length of your contracts with your customers and what's a reasonable ROI for that investment. Does it make sense, even from a dollars and cents perspective, to invest in a conveyor system if the ROI is 5, 6, 7 years from now if you're on a 3-year contract as a 3PL? So there's a tipping point and other considerations other than just cost in terms of whether or not you invest in technology and whether or not you remain using the traditional labor approach or some combination of the two. Now, if I talk about synergy of conveyor information, so I've got one example of where conveyor information has complemented WMS. In that particular scenario, WMS told us that we have 20 packers. And of those 20 packers, there's 4 types of packing and 5 employees do each type. So we've got 20 packers, 4 types, and every type of pack is very different. Some is overpack, some is master pack, some has custom boxes that need to be made. But WMS doesn't tell us that. So a traditional labor management system that has that only tells us that a pack occurred doesn't fairly assign credit to the proper employee because all the tasks are so different. So all it does is tell us a pack is a pack is a pack. And so we can't understand enough to give employees enough credit from a labor standard perspective, but also we need to understand cost to serve. So it's not just enough to give employees credit, but we have to understand what it costs me to do each one of those types of pack. In the particular instance that I'm thinking of, we had a conveyor system in place. So although WMS just said that John packed a box and he packed box 1, 2, 3, we were able to see that the conveyor diverted box 1, 2, 3 down pack line 3. Well, we know pack line 3 is overpacking. So where before we had a very limited view of what the employee was doing and we could not differentiate the two, now combining that information out of WMS with complementary information out of the conveyor system, we were able to clearly define each one of those 4 types of pack, exactly what employees were doing that, and ultimately applied the proper labor standard based on the type of effort they were doing and understood the true cost of that type of pack. From there, the facility could do optimization processes, whether it is investing in additional packing material, packing systems, whether they could bring in consultants to understand how to streamline that process, but it really outlined where their costs were, where their opportunities for gains were, and understanding the value out of that conveyor investment. So another opportunity for data synergy is implementing and tying telematics back to your labor management system. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with telematics systems, just a couple things of value that these systems provide. So telematics are typically tied to your forklift or any other powered equipment that you want to control and understand what that activity is. So a lot of times what it will tell you is how much time is that forklift traveling? Do you need to control the access? Do you need to understand who is qualified to run that a piece of equipment and who is not? So you need to make sure that it's not just sitting there ready for anyone to jump on it. You can take off. You can really control access to that as well. Is the truck hitting things, or is the forklift running into racking? And can that device tell us what the employee is doing? So those are just some of the high levels of many that a telematics system might be used for. But you can also tie your telematics system back to labor management. So if we think about passing the telematics device information back to labor management, we can talk about other things, such as fair labor standards. If you've got an employee who has to drive all over the facility in order to do their picking because they've got what I'd call a weird pick or an exclusion pick, where they're going around and just picking kind of an odd order, the amount of travel they spend moving around all of the facility is a lot more than perhaps someone who's walking down a pick path and picking high volumes of product in a very small geographic area of the facility. So from a labor standards perspective, we want to make sure that we're giving credit to that employee who has to drive all over the place. So that's a key input for labor management. Quality. Any labor management system, the concern is if you drive productivity up, that the quality of the performance goes down. So a labor management system, one of the key components is a quality component. So we're not just tracking productivity and utilization, but we're also tracking quality. From a telematics perspective, we can look at quality and say, did they hit something? So are they making impacts with their forklift into racking or to other things? We can pull that in as a quality measurement. Perhaps they're not logging off properly, which is a safety concern. We can pull those in as well, so we make sure that we're keeping track of when people aren't following standard procedure. Cost to serve. So labor management, one of the key things that labor management allows us to understand is, what does it cost me to do the task? So if we've got a lot of people who are doing a lot of travel, that travel is going to feed back to the level of productivity. And if travel time is high, so is the cost. It's a lot less expensive to pick product if it's all in one geographic area versus spread out all through the facility. What that can tell us is that we need process improvements. So process improvements might be slotting initiatives, safety initiatives, and completing checklists properly. So as you can see, it feeds into labor management, but then tells a much bigger story about quality and other pieces of your operation and whether they're effectively dialed in. One of the key components that telematics can also do is give us visibility into some dark areas, or the areas that we don't have visibility into today. So many telematics systems will allow you to go into the device and tell the system what activity you're doing. So perhaps you're unloading, or you're loading, or you're doing box making, or shuttling pallets, any number of tasks that might not necessarily have a WMS scan associated with it. Today, most facilities don't have visibility into that. So with task selection, the user on the forklift can easily go in and tell us what they're doing. So it's an opportunity for them to report that they're being productive to management. So here's a big one, and this is an emerging technology that we really need to figure out how we want to harness. So years ago, over-the-road technology, if you handle both inbound and outbound products, so maybe you own the product movement coming into and going out of the facility instead of just being within the facility. Years ago, over-the-road technology was there and available for certain facilities that wanted to make that investment. But now, as that is becoming a requirement, we're looking and seeing how we can tap into that data beyond just tracking where that truck is. So some of the information similar to telematics. some of the information we can get out of the truck can be helpful in terms of tracking productivity, cost, and quality. So the trucks can tell us what duration, how long were they driving, how many number of stops, were those stops associated with deliveries or were those stops due to traffic? You can start understanding a little bit more about what people are doing, how long it's taking them to get there, et cetera. And it also makes sure that when we know someone leaves the facility and when they came back, the over-the-road information can help us ensure that that employee was being productive and using their time wisely once they leave the facility, where you wouldn't have visibility into their activity otherwise. The big thing in terms of synergy is now we can track the employees that are driving those trucks. So where before, a labor management system was typically only tracking people within the four walls and only those people who are using RF devices for WMS. Now we can start saying, hey, I've got 15 truck drivers out there and they spend all day, every day delivering goods, and that hits my budget. And we have no visibility into what they're doing today. So the total cost to serve in terms of handling goods to the finish line is important. So are we projecting the cost of a particular activity too short because we're not capturing those costs today in terms of getting the product in and out the door? And if we understand how effective and efficient they're being out on the road, we can potentially even think about process optimization. So if we look at their level of productivity and we want to increase that productivity, we might have to start looking at dispatch systems. Maybe we have a process where we have a dispatcher who's looking at optimum routes or looking at traffic or calling ahead to the customer to make sure that when we make those stops, that those stops are as efficient as possible because the customer is ready for the delivery. So once we understand what those employees are doing, we understand the associated costs with those deliveries and that handling of material once it's outside the door, and adding that back to our total labor spend, now we can start looking at process improvement. And if we think about just taking it back to the dark area, the whole goal is to track 100% of all activity. So circling back to labor management and just driving this home is that if you have a significant portion of your employees who are not functioning in that RF WMS world, we really have to understand how we capture that information, and over the road is one of those opportunities. So wearables. I think the big thing with wearables is if you've been to any trade show or you've seen some marketing come out, wearable devices are slick, but still I'd say they're relatively unknown in terms of capability. So as technology advances and they create new products and they integrate with other systems, we can see that wearables are valuable, but moving forward in the future, I predict that they're going to have a fairly significant play a significant portion of your activity in your operation. So one of the things we can think about wearables is, does it make the productivity and work that the employee is doing easier? So instead of maybe looking at 5 devices, you're on a forklift and you have 3 screens, and then you get off the forklift and you have an RF scanner, and then you've got some other system as well. Wearables have been really helpful in tying all those systems together, so that way we make sure that an employee is using one system to be as efficient as possible versus interacting with multiple. Another thing wearables can do, if you think about it, is if we can understand what the person is doing physically. So a lot of wearable technology is tracking how the person physically handles the product and not just what product they're handling. We can start looking at whether or not they're doing that safely. We can look and see if slotting needs to change in order to make the product more efficient. And we can start seeing the ROI on wearables based on their productivity enhancements when they're not using all those additional hardware pieces. I think the key of the future of wearables is that it's going to be a multi-system integrator. So where today the RF scanner might be typically tying back to WMS, a wearable might replace the RF scanner in terms of WMS. It might also track whether the employee is lifting properly from a safety perspective. We can look and see whether or not they're doing the proper inventory moves based on proximity of a location. So are they picking a material that's not in proximity of where they should be based on geolocation? That's going to be something that's available as well. And all of that can tie back to LMS. So when we make the investment from a wearable technology, does that increase their quality of picks? Does that increase their productivity? Does that drive the cost to serve down in order to make yourself cost competitive? And then ultimately, did you get an ROI out of that wearable solution? The next one I want to talk about is just the job coding systems. And this is more, I want to say, kind of a generic term for any system that allows you to track activity that is otherwise not being captured systematic. So let's say, for instance, we've got a user who's doing value-added services, or they're doing unloading, or they're doing loading, or they're moving pallets, similar to the telematics data capture system. A job code system is really something that allows us to capture kind of start and end times for when we're otherwise not capturing data. So this is really a tool to make sure that we capture 100% of paid hours. It's also a tool that should be easy to use and is very quick to use. So we want to make sure that we're empowering employees to use a system to capture their activities, so we can put a cost to their activity and a productivity number to their activity. But also, the key with job coding systems is that it's intuitive, it's easy to use, so that way we're not turning it into an administrative effort. So when we look at job coding systems, we really want to make sure that it's something that is usable to pull in the data and that it's available to whatever employee needs it. The good thing about job code systems, if you're integrating data properly, is that it can come from anything. So you might have a job code system that's on your telematics device that a subset of your employees are using. You could also have a job code system that is hosted on a web browser or a computer or a tablet to capture data in areas that might be, or you might have employees that are not using powered equipment. You could have some folks who are tying into job codes on time clocks. So really, again, going back to that it needs to be easy and convenient, the upside to job codes is that what is convenient for one employee might not be the best option for someone else. So you can use multiple systems to collect data. So then if we talk about just additional data synergies, so we've talked about some very specific use cases, but there's also a lot of other data systems that are being used out there that can record what an employee is doing. Now, maybe the system was never intended to capture employee activity, but that doesn't mean we can't draw conclusions about what the employees are doing and how productive they are when we can tap into some of this data. So one of the examples here is order management systems. Perhaps you have front office workers or clerks who are doing order entry or preparing an order to be picked or put away, unloaded, shipped. A lot of this information that's being transacted in a computer can tell us who did it, when they did it, and what they did it. So we can start not only capturing time against the task, but we can start capturing quantities as well. So we understand what the cost is of that front office overhead work. Auditing systems, we've talked about quality before. If you have auditors who are looking at shipments and picks before they go out the door, perhaps when they're coming back in the door, we can understand what they did in terms of capturing their time. So they spent 6 hours today auditing, but we're also creating quality data for other employees. So we've got situations where, John may have audited for 6 hours, but as part of his auditing, he created quality data for 20 other employees who are not necessarily in the system, but it is a feedback mechanism for quality as well. Cycle counting and inventory, that's another activity. So as people cycle count and they check inventory, they're usually creating data that's assigned to them as well. So what location were they at? Were they pulling the trigger? How often were they pulling the trigger? So we can start giving credit to those people who are in inventory control as well. RFID. So depending on the product you're using, perhaps the product is tagged with an RFID or your employee is. If you've got the ability to track people and product using RFID technology, that tells us often when they were in a location, what product they handled, when they handled it, and how long it took. So we can start pulling that in as well in terms of completing the picture. Moving forward, one of the big pieces is also going to be real-time location services. So are employees taking optimum routes throughout the facility, or when we have a quality feedback mechanism that tells us that there was an impact on their forklift? Can we tie that telematics information back to real-time location services in order to understand where that activity happened and when that activity occurred? Returns. Returns is a big one depending on what industry you're in. So not only are you spending money getting product out the door, but if you have a high percentage of product returning back, we want to make sure that we capture that activity as well, because that's part of the total cost to serve. If you're running 30% returns, that can be a huge part of your overarching labor budget. Customer service, same thing. If we're answering calls, if we're logging things into a customer relationship database, we can start figuring out whether or not our CSRs and our other customer-facing employees are being highly utilized as well. So on to the second poll question. So the question is, what are your concerns with adding technology to your operation? So some of the options here we have is that it's an IT burden for you, or maybe perhaps it's the cost of the system or the ongoing support cost, whether or not there's a lot of labor requirements in your facility, and remaining competitive. So the answer is what we're really starting to see now is that initial cost is one of the bigger concerns at about 55, 60%, and IT burdens about 25%, and I think the remaining contributors are around 12, 15% of remaining competitive. And that's what we're seeing in the industry as well. Traditional labor management systems could be difficult in terms of tying everything together. Perhaps there is on-site hardware and software, servers. If you have homegrown systems or unique systems, there is a high level of IT requirement in terms of being able to get one system to talk to another. And there is this idea that if you don't have IT in the first place, where do you even start? The initial cost as well. In some cases, it's a significant capital cost improvement for some of the traditional systems, and then there's the ongoing support cost as well. So there's a big cost element where we need to, is getting visibility part of, is it worth the investment? On top of that, then we've talked about remaining competitive. So, if your competitors are adding technology, does that mean you should automatically do it or not? Are they getting value out of the system? Should you follow their lead, or should you focus on optimizing your labor first and see if you can remain competitive in that way before you add additional technology? So now that we've talked about labor management, Internet of Things, and some very specific use cases about very specific types of equipment and technology and automation, I want to take a step backwards and say, what does this all mean? And what does this mean for you moving forward? I think there's two things that I would recommend. And the first one is a decision workflow. So the big idea with the decision workflow is understanding how technology will complement your employee labor and how it will drive their productivity, and making sure that it feeds into a labor management system so that you can understand whether or not that investment made sense. The second piece is the idea of the integration. And I think that's the way of the future is, before you invest in any particular piece of technology, you also have to understand how that will be integrated. So what would happen if you had technology A, B, and C now, and you integrated that, and a year from now you added technology D, and perhaps that was a fourth, or maybe it replaced one of the existing. What does that mean in terms of ongoing maintenance? So what we're looking at here is what I would call my recommended decision flow and looking at technology alongside your labor. So the first thing would be identifying the technology you're looking at in the first place. What does it do? What value does it have? What's the value proposition that you've been told by the company who's developed the product? And then the second piece is, now that you know what it can do, what does it cost? So now you've understand the baseline, what it does, where it would fit into your facility, and what does it cost you? The third piece before you go any further is my recommendation is that you're optimizing and tracking your labor, because labor is a huge component. And as I mentioned earlier, labor is most likely not going away, at least today, when you invest in technology. So technology will complement your labor, make labor more efficient. It will help your teammates be more productive, more safe, but that doesn't necessarily it's replacing folks at all, or at least not everybody. So we want to make sure that we've identified the technology, the cost of that technology, and then we got to dial in our labor as much as possible. And that would be where the labor management system comes in, is understanding where we are today and what productivities we can gain by doing targeted labor optimization. Once we've analyzed our labor and optimized our labor, now we have to understand what our new baseline is. So our labor cost X 6 months ago, but now that we've focused on it and optimizing it, it costs Y. So what is that new cost to serve each process when you're using labor? At that point, you would evaluate the final step, in my opinion, would be, what is the post-technology labor requirement? So today it takes 10 people. We invest in the technology. Tomorrow it takes 6 or 4 or 8. Really understanding where that technology would plug in and how does it impact your labor. Maybe it doesn't reduce your labor headcount at all, but we believe we can get 20% increase in productivity by investing in that technology. Only then, after you've gone through that thought process, can you determine whether or not you're getting an ROI out of that technology. Or maybe, regardless, you're going to get an ROI, but maybe it's in 6 months, maybe it's in 12 years. So labor is really important to dial in and to track and understand, because then when you finally invest, if you invest in that technology, you'll be able to see the before and after impacts of that technology and ensure that you're getting value out of the system. So the first, as I mentioned, that was the first piece. It's the decision workflow for getting your labor dialed in and really evaluating a technology product. But let's say moving to the second piece is so today you have different data systems, you've got different technology, or in the future you're planning for it. As I mentioned before, the technology is changing rapidly. The thing that you're being sold today may not be even in the market 2 years from now. Maybe it's been replaced with something cheaper or different, or maybe it hasn't. So the idea is that as we move forward and the Internet of Things keeps growing and growing and growing, that the technology that you're using and changing and swapping your facility might happen fairly regularly. So my recommendation is, the big piece is not just the technology, but how you plan to integrate it in the future. So we have to understand, what integration tool you'll use. Is that handled inside or outside of your operation or your organization? Is it flexible? And the key word, I think, is flexible. So if we think about traditional labor management systems and traditional data integration tools, everything is custom coded. If you add something, you've got to make sure that your system A data flows in a very specific way to tie into your data integration tool. So the focus is making sure that you're investing in a tool and focusing on a tool that is nimble, flexible, and can add, subtract, multiply different data systems very easily without there being a data analytics interruption. So that's the key thing. If adding technology A means that you go without data analytics for 4 months and it costs you $200,000, that's not something that's going to be a viable option moving forward, just at the pace of technology. So focusing on not just the technology, but how you integrate it is going to be a key function moving forward. And that data integration tool allows all the data to be merged, co-processed, compared to each other, and that would feed into a common functional analytics tool. So you don't want your analytics tool to change. The data that feeds it in terms of granularity and information might change, but what you don't want to do is to be constantly worried about custom integrations and constantly worried about your analytics systems changing. You want those things to remain relatively constant, so that way you can focus on the big thing down the road, which is just driving your operation day to day without interruptions of data. So finally, just wrapping up the conversation today, before we go into questions, is just reiterating what we've talked about on the last couple of slides, which is unemployment rates are low. So this is why there's a bigger focus on technology than ever before. It's harder to get the right people, good people, and make them as efficient as possible. So we're looking at technology options sooner than later, and typically it's trying to leverage the technology to enhance your productivity, so that way you can keep your best labor and stop focusing so much on trying to find additional heads. The second piece is Again, you're not replacing your employees today. That's just the reality of what's going on. You're investing in technology that allows to have greater throughput, faster response to your customers. Maybe it prevents you from needing additional people, maybe fewer temps, et cetera. But really, technology and people are going to coexist for the foreseeable future. And then finally, think integration. Before you make any technology decisions, make sure you have a software or a labor management solution that is nimble enough that you can integrate any data and that it's flexible enough that as things change in the future, we can make quick swaps and keep driving forward.
Thank you for presenting this material. I would also like to thank everyone who joined us today. We hope you found this information to be relevant and valuable to your organization. If you have any questions about improving warehouse and distribution productivity, please feel free to email us at info@associated-solutions.com. Thank you and have a great day.